We have the amazing Julie Hollis with us today. So Julie is the Secretary General for EuroGeoSurveys, which is a not-for-profit organisation representing 37 European geological surveys. And it is going to be amazing hearing her insights on what geoscience communicators can learn from collaborative science. So it is going to be a great session. I hope you all enjoy it. But before we do get stuck into the presentation, I did want to ask what got you into geology in the first place?
Yeah, okay, so hi. Good question. I think like a lot of geologists I know, it was a bit of an accident. I didn't learn very much geology at school, but I was very lucky to spend a lot of time in the outdoors as a kid. Lots of hiking, camping, and particularly every Christmas holiday I spent camping at the beach with my family. And I think that my fascination with the coast and how the ocean interacted with it, and I think that probably started some interest in geology. And I ended up doing geology as an extra subject in my first year of a science degree, and that was that. I knew from there that, wow, this is what I want to do. This is really, really interesting.
I love that. That is so cool. And so then from becoming a geo to where you are now, what were some of the big steps and decisions, I guess, that led you to be at EuroGeoSurveys?
Ooh, okay, well, I started out in academia, which was really fun and really interesting. And but the big step that I took was it was partly because I ended up working in a lab, which I found not so exciting after having done lots of field work. And by chance, I saw. Sorry. I saw an advertisement for a job doing geological mapping in Greenland, and I thought, wow, that would be amazing. So I applied for it, and by some miracle, I got it. And so that started my career working for geological survey organisations, which had really where I found my niche, because it had this element of a lot of working in the outdoors, a lot of mapping, and doing very broad scope understanding of the geology. So I went down a path of working for a number of different geological surveys, and now I end up here representing all of the geological surveys of Europe, almost
Not just one, you've got to have them all. Yeah, it's so good. It's amazing. That's so amazing. So I did ask if you could bring some of your favorite pet rocks with you today.
Oh, it is a hard choice, I have so many. Like a lot of geologists, I think removalists really hate it when they have to move us from place to place because we have just so many boxes of rocks. And I thought I would bring along these two. This one is one from Greenland, where I worked for 7 years. Well, where I lived for 7 years, I worked there for longer. This is a banded iron formation, which would be familiar to a lot of Australians, but it is the oldest banded iron formation in the world. The lead in this is almost 4 billion years old, so it's remarkable. It's a very, very old rock. And then this one is a volcanic rock from the Erta Ali volcano in Ethiopia, and this rock is about 10 years old. So this is my youngest rock.
Wow, I love that. What a great choice of yes, I do remember you saying that you had quite a few special ones. So yeah, thank you for showing us. But yes, thank you so much for chatting to us today. The sun is not even up there, so I'm just so grateful that you are taking this time to talk to us. I'll let you get stuck into your presentation now, and yeah, just thank you. Really appreciate it.
All right, so when I was a relatively junior geologist, I was in my early 30s, and I was working for the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. The picture I took around that time, and I was running regional geological mapping programs in West Greenland. And on one of those expeditions, at the start of one of my field seasons, I spent about a week traveling around on a ship with two geologists, both men, much older than me, much more experienced and knowledgeable than me. And it was a trip where we should share some of our knowledge of the geology of this particular area where we were starting a mapping project. And it was a mapping project that I was going to be managing. But I found that for one reason or another, these geologists, perhaps it was a combination of not knowing me very well, being different genders, different generations, different personalities. They weren't very forthcoming in their sharing the knowledge, their knowledge of the geology, and they had a real depth of knowledge of the geology. And I left that trip feeling somewhat disappointed and excluded. And afterwards, I learned that that these geologists had actually experienced the hard way that sometimes in academia, people take advantage of your knowledge and use it themselves, because academia is competitive, and some academics, unfortunately, are less ethical than others. In my experience, not very many. But sometimes, unfortunately, there are cases where people will simply try and steal your work. But since that time, through working with many, many geologists from around the world, the conclusion that I drew for myself was that it is always a better bet to share your knowledge, and preferably all of it, because the connections and the ideas and the shared opportunities that are generated from collaboration, for me, have always far outweighed the risk of having some idea that I might think is particularly good stolen from me. So about 15 years after that field trip in Greenland, I re-established a professional connection with these two geologists who had been on this trip where I'd felt like a bit of an outsider. And they were then close to retirement, and I got involved in some joint field work with them and a lot of discussion. And I was really pleased to find that for one reason or another, perhaps because of past time or developed trust, or we were all older and I was in a different position, and at this point I'd shared a lot of information and data with them over the years. For some reason, we were able to actually collaborate and share ideas in a much more open way that immediately presented new ideas and opportunities. So now I am Secretary General of EuroGeos Surveys. It's, as Jess said, it's an organisation that represents 37 geological survey organisations of Europe. It's an organisation that's more than 50 years old, and it was established on the principle of collaboration because of the potential benefits that collaboration brings, which I will talk about more. But first, I want to start by saying a few things about why we need to communicate geoscience. And there are a lot of reasons, but I think the overarching and most pressing one is the climate imperative to do so. The need to contribute to mitigating and adapting to climate change. As a geoscientific community, we need to be able to effectively convey relevant messages to the people who make decisions about geothermal, groundwater management, geohazards that are increased by climate change, such as flooding and drought, subsidence, landslides, about where to find the mineral deposits that we need, where to store hydrogen or carbon dioxide or compressed air or nuclear waste, where to put offshore wind farms, how to monitor and manage soil health, how to develop green urban infrastructure, and the list goes on and on. So geoscientists have a lot of data and knowledge that is extremely relevant to mitigating and adapting to climate change and working towards net zero. So there is this climate imperative for us to communicate effectively. But we have lots of obstacles to achieve this effective communication that we want. So first of all, unfortunately, most people don't know very much about geoscience, and probably the biggest reason for this is just like my experience was, that geology is not taught very much at school in most countries, and much less so than it used to be. in Europe, for example, teaching of geology as a distinct discipline in secondary school has been progressively reduced in schools over recent decades. But it's not just that, it's also quite likely that the negative public perception, which is perpetuated by media depictions of geoscience often in relation to mining, also has a significant role to play. And a negative public perception is a phenomenon that has been documented in many parts of the world. For example, the Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy survey of youth perceptions of the resources industry for 2021 reported that 94% of respondents from across Australia self-reported knowing a little bit or nothing at all about the resources sector. And this is a country that has one of the largest mining industries in the world. And in a recent survey of more than 600 British people, respondents viewed geoscience as old-fashioned, boring, and environmentally damaging. And when asked, what does a geologist do? Most couldn't answer with much beyond studies rocks or something similar to that. So regarding this apparently negative perception of geoscience, which is commonly linked with the connection people make between geoscience and mining or geoscience and fossil fuels. In Canada, also another important mining country, the Mining Industry Human Resources Council in 21 reported a survey of 3,000 15 to 30-year-old Canadians, and they placed mining last as a sector that they would consider working, and that was including below oil and gas. So this negative perception has been blamed for another phenomena, which is an almost global decline in geoscience student numbers at university. So we know that the mining industry follows boom and bust cycles that follow the global commodity market prices. And geoscience student numbers tend to follow the same trend, usually with a 1 to 2 year time lag. Like you can see here, the annual index mineral price in yellow, which is shown also here in yellow, and student enrollments in different countries in the other colours. So that you can see that there's a rough correlation with a time lag, but something different has happened over the past 8 years or so. While the market has gone up, student numbers have continued to drop in many parts of the world. And no doubt COVID has had some part to play in that. But even accounting for that, by comparing the trend with other university science courses, geoscience has suffered more significantly, much more significantly, in terms of dropping student numbers. Why? Well, one reason that's commonly cited, and this is from a chapter in an Elsevier book publication on geoethics that will come out this year. One reason is a negative public perception of geoscience related to negative links made between geoscience, mining, fossil fuels, and environmental damage. And so this drop in student numbers is compounding our problem because it means that fewer people have a knowledge of what geoscience is, and we're increasing the gap between the supply of qualified geoscientists and the demand, which is expected to grow. For example, Australian labour demand for mining is projected to require almost 25,000 new workers by 2026. But there's a market forecast that only 16,000 new graduates will graduate in that period. And similarly, in the US, the American Geosciences Institute projects a deficit in the US geoscience workforce of about 130,000 full-time equivalent geoscientists by 2029, based on employment projections from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Right, So, well, why else do we need to communicate geoscience? Well, one reason is that we haven't been very good at it. And this doesn't just apply to geoscientists, it applies to scientists, to scientists more generally. And that's not at all to say that there are not some fantastic initiatives out there. But in general terms, as scientists, we haven't been particularly good at it. Why is that? The main reason is because scientists, including geoscientists, by nature, we tend to stick to this idea that if we simply tell people about our geoscience, they will learn something and they'll apply it because that makes sense. We think that's obvious. Well, that is the deficit model of communication, the idea that this negative perception results from a lack of information. And this model has these assumptions, that there is a knowledge gap, that people feel negatively about science, that this knowledge gap is responsible for their negative attitudes, and therefore that the more knowledge that they have, this will lead them to positive attitudes, and that this increased knowledge will lead to rational decision making. Unfortunately, this is all shown to be wrong. It doesn't work. And here are some very simple illustrations of this model being wrong. So, for example, 23% of the world's population smoke. I'm pretty sure almost all of them, probably all of them, have been told that it's very bad for their health, but they still do it. So simply filling the knowledge gap with the knowledge that this is bad for their health, it doesn't work. Similarly, the information that the MMR vaccine is linked to autism, this caused a significant drop in vaccination rates in the UK and then around the world, and this has never fully recovered. And that initial report has been shown to be fundamentally flawed, and there's a huge amount of evidence that there is no basis to this connection. But still, people are not vaccinating their children to the same level as before this happened. And I'm not going to go into this further because it's not the main thing I want to talk about, and plenty of other people have said a lot about this, but in very short, effective communication needs to involve knowledge of and real engagement with the audience, and needs to take account of their concerns, their values, their beliefs, their culture. So social information, not just scientific information. So from all of that, okay, we have lots of problems to deal with in communication. All of these things. But the one I want to talk about more is this one. The fact that we're often working in small, fragmented groups. And it's easy to understand why we do this. If you think about geoscience departments at university, for example, they tend to be some of the smallest university departments. Even in moderate-sized exploration and mining companies, there might be a handful of geologists, and in small ones, there is often one. Even in large geoscience organisations or associations, like the one I work for, Eurogeosurveys, we represent 37 geological survey organisations and thousands of geoscientists. In our secretariat, we have one communication officer. And that's often the case in the geological survey organisations themselves. Even if they have tens or hundreds of staff, the number of communication staff is often very low. And this is the same for many organisations, for the European Federation of Geologists. So this means that the people who actually have the knowledge of how to communicate, they often don't have the time to do anything much other than basic management of websites and social media accounts and some support to event organisation. And if there's any strategic level thinking about communicating geoscience, there's usually no or limited resources to act on those ambitions. So how do we get better at this? And here I'm not going to talk about communication methods, about which there is a lot of information out there. Here I'm going to talk about collaboration. So why is collaboration part of the answer? What are the benefits? Well, it turns out that there are lots of them. First, it's pretty well established that that collaboration increases productivity and it achieves better outcomes than its opposite, which is competition. I work in an EU environment where a lot of projects are funded by the European Commission. And this is an environment that I only started working in a couple of years ago. And before that, I wasn't as familiar with a research funding environment of co-funding and of very large consortiums of partners working on the same project. And from an outsider's perspective, it had always looked to me a little bit like a kind of a pyramid scheme where you had to put money in to get money out, and you're working with a big group of organizations, often from different countries. And I wasn't sure of the merits of this compared to with simply working with a small group and being able to focus specifically on what you want to do in competition with a whole range of other small groups doing similar things. But having read more about this framework of and philosophy of funding, I was surprised to discover that there's a good deal of science behind it because it requires collaboration. And in comparison with its opposite, competition, collaborative networks have been shown to be much better at generating innovation and greater productivity. We can take COVID-19 as a beautiful example. So research into coronaviruses goes back to the 1930s. But before 2020, no vaccine for a coronavirus had ever been produced. Then, in the space of 1 year, the world had several effective coronavirus vaccines. Why? Because of collaboration. Researchers and labs pooled their efforts because of this joint need to respond to a crisis. Competition, on the other hand, can lead to rivalry. It can close down open communication. It can exclude people who want to do things differently. It can undermine debate that can result in knowledge sharing and valuing the ideas of others. And when I say these words, I'm reminded of the personal experience that I shared at the start of the webinar, where I felt closed out of a discussion. Whereas in later life, I was able to have much more productive, open communication with the same people. So now I've already listed a range of other benefits here: knowledge sharing and capacity building, sharing ideas and opportunities, increasing diversity, access to more shared resources, which includes funding, recognition of others, public acceptance, and then also a sense of community and common direction. And importantly, also development of common standards. And I really like this one, working on shared ideals and goals. This makes it easier for people to work towards change and improvement. Compared with working in competition, which can challenge people's values and make it more difficult to reach mutually acceptable solutions. And I also really like this one. So by its very nature, collaboration bypasses the deficit model for communication and goes straight to dialogic communication, encouraging open input and engagement. So particularly if the collaboration includes not just geoscientists, but other stakeholders, ideally your ultimate audience that you want to communicate to, or the ultimate users of your geoscience, then you've gone straight to a really impactful way of delivering your geoscience or your communication efforts by involving and collaborating with your audience itself. So with all of these benefits, why don't we collaborate more? Well, lots of organizations and sectors, and academia is a good example, have a culture of competition. And culture requires a lot of effort to change, including often changing structural elements, So how funding or promotions are awarded, for example. It also requires a commitment of resources. You actually have to spend time and money on collaboration. It requires trust between partners, which also only develops over time and through experience. It requires adaptation and compromise. You can't do everything your own way anymore. It has to be a real collaboration, which requires properly engaging with your partners and finding collaborative solutions that probably won't be exactly the way that any individual partner or person wanted to do things. And it requires communication for exactly those reasons, building trust, reaching compromise. Very importantly, it also requires the right leadership, a leadership that instills trust in the good intention and the competence of others instead of fueling competition. And it requires structured processes and relationships if you wish to achieve any kind of longevity in a collaboration. So, and in regard to this, I'm sure most of us could list some fantastic geoscience communication initiatives that were exciting and successful, but they didn't last, usually because they were product of the passion of just one or a few individuals working together with limited resources. But ongoing successful examples, there are not so many of them. Another point is that collaboration is driven by reward. People or organizations will only do collaboration because they feel that they will get something out of it. So we always need to keep this in mind in trying to develop collaboration on geoscience communication or in geoscience more generally. We all have to get something out of it. But often that something in collaboration is a longer term reward, like improving the public image of geoscience, which has benefits for the whole of the geoscientific community and for society. That's not an immediate reward. And as humans, we're not so good at acting on the basis of long-term rewards and to opt for the short-term rewards if we can. And so it can be more difficult for organizations to commit to invest in research. So how do we do it? How do we successfully collaborate on geoscience communication? And I'm sorry to break it to you now, but I don't have the answer. My hope is that by sharing some of these ideas, it might generate some new insights from you, the people who are interested to tackle some of these immense challenges that we have as a geoscientific community. But I'm quite sure that it involves some combination of identifying common goals, making a common commitment of intent and of resources, of using structured processes, so identifying and using a structure, and having a leadership that generates this culture of trust, so that ultimately you end up being able to share knowledge and resources, whether that's financial, time, skills, networks, assets of other kinds, for a common purpose. I think it's very sensible to go down the line of trying to exploit existing efforts, maximizing the impact of what's already being done, and importantly, to achieve a critical mass of collaborative engagement to overcome this problem that we have, that our community is so often trying to tackle geoscience communication as a series of small, relatively disconnected, small initiatives which will achieve limited impact. So we need to somehow develop a critical mass of collaboration. If we consider top-down or bottom-up approaches to collaborative communication, there are pros and pros and cons to each, top down. So, for example, the establishment of new organisations, for example, that can come with funding, but can also seem heavy. So, administrative, prescriptive, trying to tackle too much. And bottom-up approaches can sometimes go viral, but they can be too ad hoc, not strategic enough, limited in scope, and can peter out with limited resources. So perhaps somewhere in the middle is the good ground to be in. Networking organisations and building communities for greater impact. So what I'd like to do is to finish up some of these reflections with a personal reflection, another one, on a collaborative initiative that I know very well, which is a project that our organisation has been involved in now it's in its 8th year now. It's called PanAfGeo, and it's a geoscientific training program for geoscientists of the African Geological Survey organisations. It's funded by the European Commission, and the trainings are jointly delivered by European and African partner organisations. All of them are geological surveys, and there are many partner organisations involved. And PanAfGeo started as a project that was actually quite difficult to get funding for. The value wasn't really obvious to the European Commission at the outset, but once it was underway, the bottom-up engagement between all the trainees who are involved from all over Africa, this secured a kind of living network. So, for example, the group who were involved in the very first training on geological mapping almost 8 years ago, they still communicate in a WhatsApp group today. And the continued trainings and the consistent process resulted in steadily increasing media and national government attention to the project, so that now every training is heavily publicised in national media, whichever African country is hosting the training. And the opening ceremonies are usually opened by ministerial and sometimes even state-level politicians, usually also with the involvement of EU representations to that country, often ambassadors. And there are many influential people and organisations who now want to both be involved in this ongoing project. And there was a lot of work that's gone into this to maintain the public face of the project. But I'm convinced that the success is actually grounded in the strength of the network at the level of the participants themselves, and the involved organisations from geological surveys all over Africa coming together for these trainings. PanAfGeo is not a thing. It doesn't exist in one place. There's no central office. The people who work on this project are distributed across many countries and organisations and 2 continents. But it has a very strong brand, recognised by organisations and media across Africa, and everyone wants to be part of it. Why? The key elements have been trust, communication, and commitment. And my hope is that there's something in this that can help us find a path to a more universal and impactful collaborative means of communicating geoscience for the benefit of society. Thank you.
That was awesome. I'm glad the light is showing through the window now. So thank you. You're amazing for doing that. And yeah, go get a coffee and enjoy your day. But yeah,
All right, thanks so much
for
for the invitation. It was a pleasure.